Hello, everyone. I'm Martin, and I have been hurt in my life by Agile. This is a serious thing. This has knocked my mental health on more than one occasion. I'll get more onto that in a bit. This is also my first time delivering this talk. I'll be honest, I only finished it this morning. So if you've got feedback, I would love to hear it. I can be reached here. There's no Q&A time either, but I would love to pick up the conversation with anyone on either of these platforms. And also, if you work at 8th Light, you can talk to me on Slack, as I should hope you know. This talk is fundamentally an overview of project management in software engineering from the perspective of myself, a software engineer. You have probably been to daily stand-ups or worked with a Scrum Master, but you might not have ever read up on things like Scrum or Kanban, and you almost certainly do not have any project management accreditations. And so in order for us to actually get started on this journey, we probably need a little bit of scene setting to make sure we're all on the same page. There is one ground rule for you as you watch this talk, and that is to recognize that teams are all different. Their people are different and their needs are different. So for instance, let's start with a hypothetical project. You're on a small team and programming is awesome. You're slinging code, smashing out features, and having just a whale of a time. Life is good. And then you fast forward a little, and this project is a huge success, but the team is slightly larger, and you can't quite keep track of things in your brain anymore. You may occasionally stare out of the window and think wistfully about the days when things seemed more fun. And then if we fast forward a lot, this project has conquered the world. It's really amazing. The team is gigantic. However, it is virtually impossible to know what most of the teams that work on most of the services are up to at any one time. For some reason also, the marketing team now also has to sign off on your releases into production. These are three hypothetical stages of a product's lifecycle, and perhaps it seems really obvious, but I really want to make it clear that your project management needs are going to be totally different in each of these totally hypothetical and not at all real situations. And one thing I'll really be constantly trying to hammer home today is there is sadly no one-size-fits-all project management solution that you can just buy into and relax as it solves all of your problems. And I encourage you to treat anyone who tells you otherwise with the same skepticism you would as if they were trying to tell you that Pepsi genuinely tastes better than Coke. Still, in my experience, most companies start to get serious about project management at a certain point in their growth, roughly when they hit that middle-ish sizing. And that's usually because it's been observed that there has been a noticeable slowdown in output because of team sizing or code size or what have you. And oh no, you're now entering the world of glamorous stock photo imagery where groups of smart, creative, thoughtful people point urgently at whiteboards covered in Post-it notes. Here I can and must mention that 8th Light is a tippy-top software consultancy that can help you with this very problem, and I earn my keep doing such things. Please hire me to point at Post-it notes with you. But with that out of the way, today I'll take a whistle-stop tour through some of the most popular frameworks for managing a software project: Agile, Kanban, and DevOps. And along the way, there will be some of my tears. We will start with the methodology that ate the world, Agile. In 2022, every company says they're Agile. Few companies would dare to be seen as unagile. But what actually is it? The most accurate thing I've ever heard it described as is trauma. The movement was essentially conceived in 2001 by a group of developers as a response to inefficient company management. And I'm going to step back and sort of redefine my use of Agile here. By Agile, I'm going to mean the various and copious amounts of approaches, instances, and methods that use the phrase to describe themselves. I will not always be talking about the full spirit of the manifesto for Agile software development. You do not need to leave me an aggressive comment saying that I am failing to comprehend the learnings of its original intentions. And I'm making that clear because the whole agile world has become a bit of a difficult and confusing soup of buzzwords and certifications. It has, if not in spirit, but in reality, been plundered somewhat by the bad management that it was designed to overcome. So agile is a wonderful idea, beautifully positioned, that has sadly and inadvertently caused some trauma of its own. Because agile really is a mindset. You do not implement agile, but you become it. And I still haven't really said what it actually is. So if you ask me, agile is, it's continuous delivery. And by that, I mean a total, all-encompassing drive to regularly and incrementally deliver software to customers. And by customers, that's whoever uses your project. It's small accountable teams. So it's a push for these teams to organize into smaller, often self-organized teams who work in those small cycles. And it's about eliminating waste. So it's a never-ending focus on reducing top-down hierarchies, needless management, and chafing bureaucracy. Agile, the mindset, however, is often brought to life in business with varying levels of success by popular agile frameworks, like Scrum. Scrum is named after rugby, which for any Americans in the room looks like the above. And I'm also sure anyone in software engineering feels like they've been in a Scrum after coming out of some of their sprint planning meetings. We will get to those. Scrum is the most synonymous implementation of the methodology. It is very popular. If you have done agile in the workplace, then that has most likely been Scrum. And to do Scrum, you organize into small teams comprised of 10 or fewer people, and these teams contain a product owner who is accountable for the value of the work delivered by the Scrum team, a Scrum master who is accountable for running the Scrum and removing impediments that affect the rest of the team, and everybody else. And then as that team, you learn to embody that agile mindset alongside practicing a series of more formal events. These events start with the sprint, which is a fixed length development window of 1 month or less. And most commonly, I think it's 2 weeks. The point of a sprint is to achieve a small, actionable product goal within the confines of that timeline. You have something to deliver at the end of it. The second event is sprint planning, which most commonly manifests as what you could only politely say, quite a long meeting, which is designed to take items out of a product backlog and place them into an upcoming sprint. Then there is the Daily Scrum, which was, I think, previously officially known as stand-up, but they've renamed it, I think, due to the fact that I've never actually been in one of these meetings where people are standing up. But this is a 15-minute or less check-in where the team discusses its daily progress towards that sprint goal. Then there is the sprint review, where the outcome of a sprint is presented to key stakeholders and its progress towards the goal is discussed. The most obvious anti-Scrum red flag sits right here. If there are regularly no key business stakeholders at this meeting, or worse, they've pretended that they'll watch a recording of this meeting, then whatever your management team says, your company probably does not believe in Scrum. And then finally, there's the Sprint Retrospective, where the participants of the previous sprint discuss ways to improve effectiveness in the next sprint. And that's really the entirety of Scrum. It doesn't really need a super long course to go through it. Like, you can encapsulate it in just those events. And when done with a team that's supported and invested in the idea, I think the effects can be pretty significant. Sadly, I'm sure many of us have probably never or rarely experienced that in the workplace. Behind Scrum in popularity, there is extreme programming, another framework, and one that differs from Scrum in a few key areas. It is largely more amenable to change during a development iteration, so a sprint, but it's also much more prescriptive with software development practices. Teams that adhere to extreme programming will be doing test-driven development, and they will be doing pair programming. These things are mandatory to be an extreme programming team. And I find that teams who identify as sort of they've bought into extreme programming are often a little more successful at adopting the methodology than teams who identify with Scrum. And I think a lot of that is actually just largely because extreme programming is a lot more effort and therefore requires a much greater level of buy-in and investment. So I think many of the teams that do it are psychologically more ready and willing to push for changing their values than teams who do Scrum. So it's not, I think the success doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily down to extreme programming itself. It's about the willingness to sort of take it on board, which, you know, I'm sure you don't always see in the teams that have to do some of these frameworks. And then last and least, there is SAFe, the Scaled Agile Framework. I am sure this has worked in some contexts, but most commonly it's seen in large enterprise companies who have been told that they can fully and successfully adopt the agile mindset by changing virtually nothing about their business whatsoever. Who could possibly say no? At its core, SAFe takes the idea of small teams and integrates them as a set of sort of stacking dolls into an agile release train. There is a lot going on. But out of all three of these frameworks, the journey of a business from where they probably currently are to where they want to go involves the least amount of change with SAFe, despite the complexity of this image. But also, this image looks really complicated, so therefore it must be good. So you can understand why it's popular within a certain setting. And I don't want to sound too reductive. In the right context, I'm sure you can see great success with SAFe. But like many of these things, if it's adapted in the wrong way or it's adapted half-heartedly, I don't think you'll see the value you want. There are other agile frameworks available, but the key thing here is that they all generally prescribe to a series of practices and events as ways to embody the mindset of the Agile Manifesto. I don't want to sound too down on Agile. Like, I think it is full of powerful, transformative ideas. But as I sort of wrap up on this section, I do think it's important for us to be able to separate in our heads Agile, the mindset, with Agile, the reality. Next up, I will switch to Kanban. This is a Kanban board. The Kanban board itself has become totally synonymous with software engineering, but it's actually applicable all over the place. This example is from the perspective of a content marketer. It is easy to see why Kanban is so popular. It is easy to understand. I think it looks good. I think I like looking at a Kanban board. Like, there's just something about staring at it that I think is cool. It makes life feel sort of beautifully and predictably linear. And I don't know anyone who doesn't secretly love the tactile feeling of moving cards across these columns. If you need a Kanban overview, a Kanban board creates a series of workflow columns, and it lays out a collection of work items as cards into those columns. Cards progress from the top of the leftmost column, often called like backlog or to do, and they progress column by column, left to right, over to the rightmost column, which is often called done or completed or finished. It's sort of the celebratory column that we like to put things into eventually. At its core, though, a Kanban board is about visualizing the work that people are doing. And that's a really important part of this. It's designed so that we can all see what everyone is doing. It's hard to think about this now, but the Kanban board wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now at the onset of the Agile movement. And in software engineering, the rise of Scrum and the rise of Kanban have been somewhat intertwined. Scrum is now commonly visualized with a Kanban board. Kanban itself is a light touch philosophy compared to Scrum, but its key component is called cycle time. And this is the time it takes for a card to go from the beginning of its active development through to being released into the world. Sometimes I think it would be nice if we tracked the overall lead time, which starts the moment a card is added to the backlog, which would encourage product owners to not just let their Kanban backlogs swell to a rough average of approximately infinity. Kanban itself is one of the most recognizable workflows associated with lean manufacturing, a movement that was largely credited to Toyota starting from the middle of the 20th century. Lean was a response to the mass production manufacturing model popularized by US companies like Ford and General Motors at the start of the 20th century. Lean went gangbusters in 1990 when it was introduced in a best-selling business management book, The Machine That Changed the World. I recommend this book. I enjoyed reading it a lot when I was researching this talk, and I think it's a good one to pick up. Lean manufacturing is fundamentally about the elimination of waste, which is broadly defined as anything that does not deliver value to a customer. This, applied to software development, often manifests itself in things like developers who have nothing to do, or the time they'll be bogged down with by doing hefty context switching between jobs. Essentially though, Kanban and Lean are intermingled together, and truly adopting a Kanban philosophy means more than just having one of those attractive boards. My understanding of Lean includes three main principles. The first is identifying value, where we work out exactly what our requirements are, and we do not commit to unnecessary or unneeded features, even if implementing Kafka would be super cool. Secondly, it's about creating flow, which means that the cycle time of our cards runs neatly and smoothly through our process, and all cards do not get stuck in code review for 14 days. And then finally, it's about this concept of establishing pull, which is where work happens only because there's a demand for it. Put all of these together, and you once again achieve that much desired state of continuous improvement, which is a phrase we mentioned with Agile as well. And I think all things together, adopting Kanban requires less overall investment for a team while still being able to deliver noticeable results. But I do think one of the potential downsides of a Kanban philosophy in software engineering is that it is very, very easy for work that you would see marked as like hygiene or quality of life to forever be pushed to the end of a backlog. Whereas with a Scrum sprint, you can theoretically define a percentage of your sprint to these kind of tasks. So if you've only ever just used a Kanban board, I'd encourage you to give the overall lean philosophy a go and see where it gets you. There's very little cost in attempting to adopt it, which makes it very easy to test out. And then finally, we'll look at DevOps. This is the most recent framework that's joined this buzzword pantheon. And as an aside, make it to the end of this talk and you'll be eligible to post this accreditation to your LinkedIn. I joke, but I'm sure there's at least one course out there offering a official certification as a certified Lean Agile DevOps Scrum Master, and I hope they don't sue me. DevOps was partially a response to on-the-ground learnings from teams implementing Scrum. One pain point was that it was challenging to live up to Scrum's focus on continuous delivery to customers when there ended up being frequent bottlenecks when it came to actually deploying, maintaining, and running the software being created. And so the foundational principle of DevOps was born. You build it, you run it. Teams that would normally or had previously been categorized as development teams or operations teams would become cross-functional teams, boosting their team autonomy, ownership, and helping, in theory, eliminate bottlenecks that would crop up on both sides. I'm really just scratching the surface of DevOps here, but one of the most exciting and in some ways radical elements of DevOps practice is that the DevOps research and assessment team, DORA, which was later acquired by Google, spent years investing in empirical research and identified 4 key metrics to indicate high-performing teams. I love these metrics. They are deployment frequency, or how often your team can successfully get code into production. Lead time for changes, which is how long it takes for your commits to your main branch to reach production. Change failure rate, or how regularly your releases to production cause problems. And then time to restore service, which is how often it takes, how much time it takes to restore normal service after production has exploded. At this point, I really need to just expose my own bias here for these metrics to the work of the DORA team and of any useful metric I can use to make a fancy graph. But I feel that I can say with reasonable confidence that if a team at a mid-sized company or above doggedly pursues continuous improvement, there's that phrase again, with these 4 metrics, they will almost automatically find themselves pursuing, adopting, and embodying many of the other principles I've mentioned today. And I think that is a beautiful thing. But just to come crashing back down to reality, adoption of DevOps has, in my experience, often been affected by company org charts. Companies who shape their org chart with a head of operations and a head of engineering will often find themselves being subsumed by internal politics that they can never integrate. And I'm sure we've all seen at least one place where the operations team just rebadged themselves as the DevOps team and nothing at all changed whatsoever. This is not great, but it just shows you the extent of the problem that we find ourselves in sometimes. And honestly, like a lot of this probably feels a bit heavy. Like what on earth can we do with all of this information? One of the ways I've learned to process and digest all of this internally in my soul is to wholesale lift the concept of principles, practices, and values from extreme programming. And that's not me saying you should do extreme programming, although I think it's worth looking into, but that this particular model succinctly encapsulates much of my frustration to the application of these frameworks and methodologies in the wild. So we'll start with values. Most companies have values, and they're usually things like honesty, transparency, what have you. Values are good, but their problem is that they exist at a somewhat abstract level. There is usually more than enough wiggle room that you can do pretty much whatever you want and claim it respects the spirit of your values. Then there's practices. We do our practices on a day-to-day basis. Much of what we've discussed so far today has been a practice. We go to stand-up meetings, we move tickets across a Kanban board, we do or do not choose to write tests for our code. Simply adhering to practices does not automatically mean you are embodying values. In short, you or a colleague or company's management can trudge along to daily stand-up without giving much of an interest about things like collaboration or communication. And finally, extreme programming presents principles as the bridge between values and practices. Principles are specific to the domain of your team and your work, and may, for instance, be that your team understands that the practice of coming together to unblock a WIP limit helps achieve their value of shared communication and focus on continuous delivery. As extreme programming puts it in the book, values bring purpose to practices, and practices bring accountability to values. The most common breakdown I see in teams is a values and practice mismatch. So I categorically believe that bringing in a certified agile DevOps Scrum Master and turning many practices into rote chunks of everyone's day won't help your company achieve the values it often says it wants. And in reality, it's probably the opposite. And to conclude, I wanted to think about why these philosophies are so hard to actually actualize at work. I have a couple of personal theories as to why. The first is that many companies, including 8light, tie compensation and job titles to the outcomes of performance reviews. And the vast majority of performance reviews are judged almost entirely on individual performance. And as long as this is true, there will always be a slight tangible mismatch between business reality and any of these frameworks and methodologies, which frequently proclaim the importance of a team. And I have seen this a few times when a business is forced to contract for whatever reason. Teams at various levels of coordination almost immediately shrink back to a more individual state of work. Quality of work is obviously very important, but I do believe that people will largely optimize for compensation and responsibility increases as well. And then Secondly, it's always seemed majorly counterintuitive to me that a core message of these many popular frameworks is that teams should anticipate and embrace change. But often company management structures decide to rigidly tie everyone to a fixed process, come what may. And I think that's because a lot of businesses regularly prioritize predictability over encouraging change. And I can understand why, but it leads us into a situation where team leads who would once have found themselves promoted for agitating for change become incentivized to produce regular, reliable, and consistent results. The entire risk proposition of introducing process change to a company has been inverted. And I'm not sure how we always get away from that. Now, look, I have the utmost respect for every single one of the methods I've spoken about. And I truly think that an energized team that actively wants to implement any of these frameworks into their work can see enormous, gratifying success. If you are in a position to do this at your company, I implore you to do so. But even if your management have forced you to subscribe to something that's Agile, Kanban, or DevOps in name only, I also encourage you to use the opportunities that these frameworks can still provide as best you can. SAFe, for instance, should provide the passengers of its Agile release trains semi-regular opportunities to get face time with key important stakeholders as part of its program increment meetings. That face time is probably something that would be really, really hard to get if you're working at an organization big enough to look at adopting SAFe to begin with. And when you have those opportunities, I think we really need to take them. I also think no matter what framework you're supposed to be working in, crafting high quality code that's easy to deploy on command is going to help you out. The goal here is to have your main branch constantly deployable. In a doomed Agile environment, I think being able to deploy on command is the single greatest way to relieve teams of some of the stresses of working on such a project. And ultimately, I think everything here is a product of its time. Everything we've spoken about today is basically a response to something else that at one point was enormously successful and seen as the done way of doing things. Changes in culture, technology, and just our relationship with work itself will adapt over time. So change is inevitable. But I think to have a really high-performing team today and for the foreseeable future, you will need to optimize for people and not processes. And I do dearly hope that I am proven right about that down the line. Thank you very much, and I hope that was interesting for you.